Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be moderating today's conversation on refugee flows and human rights. And we have today a panel of four esteemed experts with different disciplinary focuses and different areas of expertise. And we'll now introduce them. But before we do so, Estefanía, Castaneda, and I will introduce ourselves since we will be moderating today. Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Estefanía Castaneda Perez. I'm a third year in the political science department, and I study the perceptions of transborder commuters on state violence at ports of entry, how that impacts sense of belonging, mental health, and sense of legal empowerment.
And my name is Chiara Galli. I'm a PhD candidate in the Sociology department, and my research is ethnographic, and it looks at unaccompanied minors' experiences in the U.S. legal process and in the asylum process. Without further ado, now we're going to introduce our scholars today. So first, Karida Brown is Assistant Professor of Sociology at UCLA. Her research focuses on the relationship between race, social transformations, and communal memory. Her book, Gone Home, Race and Roots Through Appalachia, reconstructs the life histories of a cohort of African Americans who migrated throughout the Appalachian region during the African American Great Migration. Her new research project, The Origins of Racial Inequality in Education, undertakes a global history of segregated schooling and its enduring legacies on race and education today. Next, we have Anne Gilliland, is Associate Dean for Information Studies at UCLA. Her research addresses record-keeping and archival systems and practices in support of human rights and daily life in post-conflict settings, particularly in the countries emerging out of the former Yugoslavia. She has also studied rights in records for forcibly displaced persons, the role of community memory in promoting reconciliation in the wake of ethnic conflict, bureaucratic violence, and the politics of metadata, digital record keeping, and archival informatics.
UCLA. Her research focuses on the impacts of legal regime and laws on Central American immigrants in the U.S. and living in context of multi-sided violence on individuals, especially women in Latin America. Her work has appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, Social Problems, International Migration Review, Ethnic and Racial Studies, among other journals. She's the author of the books Immigrant Families, Fragmented Ties, Salvadorian Immigrant Networks in America, and Enduring Violence, Latina Women's Lives in Guatemala. She is co-editor of Constructing Immigrant Illegality, Critiques, Experiences, and Responses, Latinos as in the United States, Changing the Face of America, and When States Kill, Latin America, the U.S., and Technologies of Terror. Next, Michael Rodriguez is professor and vice chair in the Department of Family Medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at UCLA, Fielding School of Public Health, founding director of the UCLA Bloom Center on Poverty and Health in Latin America, founding chair of the UCLA Global Health Minor, co-editor of UCLA Firearm Violence Prevention Center, and founding director of the Health Equity Network of the Americans, an international network with representatives from 26 countries. Dr. Rodriguez is published widely in the areas of research that include ethnic, racial, and immigrant health equity, gun and intimate partner violence prevention, and primary care systems. So it is a very interdisciplinary panel.
So we're going to structure the conversation around four questions that have a lot of sub-questions. So for the first one, bear with me, please. So when do migratory flows become crises? And so thinking about this question along several dimensions. So first of all, who gets to define certain flows as crises, and also which flows get defined as crises? So what groups of immigrants going where? Secondly, what role do politics and media play in the construction of crises? How are personal testimonials used in the construction of these crises, and to what extent are they dehumanizing refugees or humanizing and dignifying their experiences? And finally, how are the vulnerable qualities of migrants themselves used in the construction of crises or in the construction of personal narratives? And so some vulnerable qualities we might consider are, for instance, illness, childhood, or pregnancy. Would you like to
Great. And is the format, do we just go down the line?
I believe so, right?
Okay,
Yes.
sure. So, broadly, how do migrant flows become crises or defined as a crisis? And I think a lot about a historical case, the historical case of the origins of the African American Great Migration in the U.S., right? An internal migration that we really don't think about as a crisis, but it certainly was defined that way in the early 20th century. So I'll just kind of touch on this story to kind of illuminate, one example of how this is played out historically in the U.S. Right after the American Civil War, the federal government constitutes the Freedmen's Bureau of Abandoned Lands and Refugees. And who were those refugees? The newly freed, formerly enslaved African Americans in the U.S. And the federal government came and occupied the South. They occupied 11 states in the South for almost a 10-year period. And this was for the Reconstruction era. By 1877, the Great Compromise came about, and this was the compromise to elect the Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes. And in exchange for, that political brokerage, the federal government agrees to leave the South. What happens then? The Reconstruction era ends. And immediately, what starts to come on the books across state legislatures across the South are these labor agent licensing acts, which makes the facilitating labor migration of agricultural workers, right, and who is that, out of the South illegal. And so to do so, labor agents had to register by county per state at the price of $5,000 US per county. Okay, and we're talking 1880s US dollars, right? So really restricting out migration, but we all know that by the 1910s, 1920s, the African American Great Migration gets underway anyway. This is during the World War I era. And the Department of Labor, the Secretary of Labor, sends a few agents down to the South because they hear that a mass migration might be underway, right? And this investigative council is sent out to investigate a potential national security threat. A national security threat of African Americans leaving the South and infiltrating cities in the North, outside of the South, and posing an economic threat, taking the jobs of deserving whites, right? And this is a time when 90% of the black population in the U.S. still resided in the South. So the idea of a mass migration really was not only considered a crisis, but was framed by our own federal government as such. So here we have an inverse case, right? And I don't know if it's the only one that we have, the only case that we have like this in U.S. history, but I know that it's quite unique, where interstate migration is actually policed to keep the bodies inside the borders of the state, right? So I think that this example kind of complicates how populations can be othered and dehumanized, not only between borders, but within, right? And how the other is constructed. So that's kind of one kind of fruitful case that I think of as an anomalous case to how we think about the contemporary kind of constructions.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little bit more contemporary, if I may. I think we have to start and continue with some of your with your points, Karida. But we have to start with the definitional question, because definitions matter quite a bit. Once a migratory flow is defined as a crisis, we tend to suspend our understandings and our commonly held understandings, theoretical approaches, frameworks, because we are confronted with a migratory flow that supposedly has reached a critical phase, something very different, and it therefore it is unlike any other flow. So there is a semantic issue here, as I think there has been a bit of an overuse of the term crisis. Crises are supposed to be exceptions to the norm, turning points, something acute and different. However, it seems to me that today there are more and more situations that are classified as crises, but that perhaps are not. The meaning of the term is then diffused when it's used, overused like that. The meaning of the term is diffused and sometimes inappropriately used, even as it generates real consequences and responses, because as we know, once a situation is defined as a problem, even if it's constructed, it has real consequences. We need to be more precise, therefore, in the use of this language, because we risk pathologizing the movements and the individuals who participate in them. When migratory movements are conceptualized as crises, they also acquire a specific temporal dimension, as immediate and largely disconnected, as they are conceptualized as immediate and largely disconnected from previous events and history, which shapes policy responses. Palliative solutions to address an immediate manifestation and not a root cause become policy. As Jane McAdam notes, crises are posited as exceptions, requiring special solutions. From a policy perspective, this risks sidelining everyday systemic issues such as poverty, vulnerability, and environmental fragility, which are central to how people experience hazards, and overlooking relevant legal frameworks such as human rights law. This is not to say that catastrophic events around the world, such as the effects of climate change or wars and conflicts and other natural disasters, are not grave or real. The point I'm trying to make here is that when a migratory flow is understood as a crisis, as one point in time event, certain responses that focus on the immediacy of the event are activated, which can then have counterproductive consequences, as they may disregard deeper and more entrenched inequalities based on class, race, gender, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, among other social cleavages that affect the migrants and the non-migrants alike, and may in fact further cement inequalities through narratives of deservingness. Perhaps we can then look at the contexts that produce migratory flows, as well as the context they enter, because it is the context they enter that defines flows as crisis or as refugee flows or migratory flows. While events and processes may be the trigger or immediate cause of a humanitarian crisis, in most cases, underlying structural factors or contemporaneous stressors produce the context in which they occur. Are some of the migratory flows a new normal? In which case are they really crises? Does today's new normal render almost inadequate the use of the term crisis to describe flows that have been ongoing for a long time, but experience maybe a temporary spike, or flows that become permanent because the conditions that generate them have not changed for a long time? If certain migratory flows around the world are being redefined as crises or classified as such, we need to understand what makes migratory flows a crisis. How does a natural phenomenon of human migration that has occurred throughout history become an anomaly and a source of concern in receiving countries? So perhaps it is important for us to examine when a migratory flow becomes a crisis, why and who defines them as such. So I'm going to stop there.
I actually would like to pick up on that point just a little bit and think about when a migratory flow becomes more than the norm that has been going on, because migration flows have existed for long amounts of times, but they can turn into crises when conditions at home are exacerbated. And when they stop also being sometimes a backwards and forwards flow and become a flow just in one direction. The part of the world that I've done a large amount of my work in, Southeastern Europe, is a very long tradition both of migration to the United States, to Canada, to New Zealand, to Australia, but also a sort of Gastarbeiter system where people went for large parts of the year to Austria, to Germany, and then came home, and it was a backwards and forwards. But when war broke out, it was a unidirectional flow, and it was a totally different kind of crisis. But it's really interesting to think about how often multiple forms of migration crises occur within the same location, within the same regional footprint, and to try to think about why that is and when it is considered to be a crisis and when it's considered to be more of a norm. And as somebody who works with information flows and with documentation, I say we can observe these different layers of migration crises through the archival record, but we can also see it in other ways, interacting on the ground. So, for example, the current so-called Balkan route is right through areas of people who were displaced themselves and were refugees during the wars in the 1990s, and that some of them continued into the 2000s, and that interaction between two populations who have experienced displacement through war creates a very interesting difference in politics between those regions and the governments of those countries, and the now very much right-tending government rhetoric that is coming out in Croatia, in Hungary, and places like that. And it's a very interesting sort of mitigating effect where it's sort of conflicting some of the sort of tendencies of the country against the responses to these new refugee flows that are coming through them. And so we can see that happening on the ground, and over time we will see it reflected in the kinds of documentation. I want to say a little bit about new kinds of documentation, because something that has changed considerably from that period to this period now is we have the internet, we have smartphones, we have social media. And to think a little bit about what the contributions of these new technologies are to the recognition of a crisis, the global recognition of a crisis in locations that in the past people may not have heard very much about, not understood very much about. Smartphones and social media are being used by migrants of all kinds for all sorts of reasons. They are using it to connect to reunite with, to reassure their loved ones that they're separated from by various kinds of circumstances. They're used to transmit information about the routes that they're taking, about what's happening at the borders that they're attempting to cross, perils along the way, rivers where people are drowning, minefields that they might walk into by mistake, mountains that they might get lost in snowstorms, and sources of aid. Where are their phone charging stations? Where is there water? Where is there a receptive farm along the way? And they're also using it to document their experiences and their routes firsthand, and to draw attention to their situations. And so what we have for the first time is an unprecedented amount of firsthand, immediate documentation going out across the world through social media to people who repeat it to other people, to reporters, to whoever you can reach, that I think in many ways is been very important in humanizing the migrant experience and the refugee experience, and setting up a situation where you cannot refuse to see it. You see it firsthand. And the other thing I would say about this is that the other people who are also sending out this kind of information are the people on the ground through which people are moving, in the villages, in the farms. And that is also being heard. And I think it contributes to a more immediate recognition in the metropole, for example, of these crises that are happening, because there are multiple voices that have not been heard in the past. This is a significantly different situation from historical examples, really right up until the end of the 1990s. You know, we all know it's been argued that the Armenian genocide was ignored by so many countries as a crisis because it wasn't known. And to this day, the documentation that does exist is very much locked up and out of reach. So what does it mean when we now have so much first-hand, immediate documentation of this experience, and how does that contribute to our sense of crises?
I'm impressed at all this analysis. I'll build on that and perhaps start with a political aspect that contributes to why when migratory flow becomes a crisis. And a more recent example is when a president doesn't get what he wants. Okay? And in order to save face, he declares an emergency. And he says that we need a wall. And in such doing, he wins, no matter what happens, because he shows that he's out there fulfilling his promise. Forgets the part where he said Mexico was going to pay. But the ability to do that is because of discrimination. So doing that discriminates against folks of color, low-income people, indigenous people, communities, all of which are communities that have higher representation along the border. There are certainly much less discriminatory and much more effective manners to address migration across our border than to build a wall. But this crisis can be constructed because it is portrayed to be something that is necessary to stem immigration, to stem child smuggling, to stem drug trafficking, to stem violent crime, and possibly also to protect jobs and economy. Amazing. And yet, as I said, there's this underlying basis of discrimination. This president has many previous examples of discrimination. The language used, the most commonly referred to Mexicans as rapists and drug dealers, dismissing home nations of immigrants as shithouse, something like shithouse places, right? Shithouse nations. There's no immigration crisis at the border. There's no emergency when the Republicans controlled the White House or the Senate for the past 2 years. Historic, undocumented numbers and rates at historic lows. Most folks who arrive here in the U.S. with papers overstay their visas. Those are the ones who represent the majority of those who are undocumented here. Most migrants, most migration is by family migration, not by unaccompanied minors. There's no drug crisis at the border. Most illicit narcotics are entering through ports of entry and over water. There's no crisis of violent immigrant crime. Crime is lower among undocumented persons than among the general population. The wall does not benefit African Americans or Latinos and other low-income people, saving their jobs from low-paid immigrants. Unemployment rates have continued to be generally lower over the past two administrations. These are constructed, socially constructed things. The crisis is socially constructed. This crisis is political. So how can a crisis be defined by a political act using discrimination against historically marginalized populations?
Okay, so we're going to go on to our next question now, which is how do state, humanitarian, and other actors respond to migrant flows once they have been defined as crises? And in particular, what kinds of policy decisions are made, and how are migrants classified and, as a result, treated? And secondly, what are the factors that shape these responses? So on the level of migrant characteristics, what factors such as age, gender, and race may shape these responses? And on the other hand, also how do other considerations such as domestic policy versus international pressures also shape these responses?
All right. We're going to go this way. Great question. So, well, I'll continue then. How do we respond? I guess depends who's doing the driving, right? So, in our case, it's the federal government doing the driving. And again, it is driven by the same types of stereotypes, the same issues of discrimination, the same fears. So what do? We decide that we're going to detain folks. We decide that we're going to use children as a tool, as a deterrent. That may be contributing to why we did not sign the international human rights respecting international document for respecting human rights of children. But in this case, children have been used. They have been used by being separated by their parents. That's not new. But the way that this administration has done it is hit a new low in the way that children have been separated, in the ways in which they had to stop and try to reunite them by a court order. And even after they did that and they had a time by which they were supposed to have reunited, they didn't do it. There's still, I don't know, over hundreds or some number of children that they don't even know where they are. And it's okay because they're not really human. And so therefore there's the whole dehumanization of these immigrant children. They're not children. And so we're silent. And it's the silence that allows it to continue. Now, we're not silent against everything. While some of us may argue with the degree to which rights of women have changed and evolved, and the amount that we need to do, certainly new events in Virginia have highlighted some of the reaction and the limited tolerance around violence against women, as well as discrimination, racial discrimination. But when it comes to immigrants, we stay silent. And so we're not there. And it's being used. And it's been used, and it continues to be used. And so the policies can be developed in that way, taking advantage of a population that is described in terms that make them not human, and make it tolerable for us to do intolerable things against children and families, to detain them and withhold health care such that you have deaths. A 7-year-old child died. Adults have died. Adults have committed suicide in detention centers funded by public taxpayers. Why is that okay? It's not okay. But it's allowed to continue because of the silence.
Okay. Again, thinking about this in terms of information technology and documentation, there has, of course, in recent years, and particularly in the last couple of years, been vast deployment of technology for data gathering, for surveillance, data matching, tracking of individuals, again, contributing to the dehumanization, reducing people literally to bits, and removing their humanity and ignoring their human rights. I think we're going to talk in a minute a bit more about some of this. But let me say something more about documentation, because I think it's fair to say that documentation is something that has been completely weaponized in recent crises. Impossible documentation production requirements have been put in place, and I'm not just talking about the United States, I'm talking about all over the world. I was recently in Sweden, which requires a minimum of 10 particular kinds of documents to be produced, which must be the original documents, not copies, not certified copies, not certified digital copies, but original documents in asylum hearings. And these requirements also are subject to constantly shifting regulatory requirements. So even trying to stay abreast of what these requirements in the United States are shifting day by day about what is needed. And it's become very, very easy at a border or in a hearing or in other situations just to be able to say, we don't trust your documents, or you don't have the documents. And that's the end of it. That's the end of the discussion. And we're talking about everybody having to produce this documentation. We're talking about babies having to produce this documentation. We're talking about women who, in the situations that they came from, never ever were in contact with bureaucracies of any sort, where that was taken care of for them by men. We're talking about people from African nations that simply never created these documents, trying to get across the Mediterranean to be hit by a regime of European expectations of what kinds of evidence, documentary evidence, they can produce. We're talking about populations that speak languages that have no textual equivalent, and there is nobody available to translate for them, who are asked to sign, again, documents that sign away their children, take them away from them in violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So documentation has become a weapon. There are people who are working to try to redress that, certainly in our field, but it's very, very difficult. There is no guarantee of there is in fact no advocate on the records or documentation side who works alongside an asylum lawyer at the border here in the US, and you don't have a right to a lawyer to start off with, but people like us, we know exactly what the issues are with records. We know where to find them. We know how to get some sort of verification of their validity. We know how to argue for when data points aren't exactly the same from document to document. This is another way that you can get your case tossed out. Somebody mistranslated or mistranscribed your name from a different script into the Latin script. Somebody reversed your date of birth on one document out of 10, 15, 20 documents. We know other places you can find documents when you can't get a hold of your own. We're asking people to produce documents who are fleeing from countries that never want to see them back and will never give them access to their own documents. We're asking people to produce documents that they don't even know exist. There are all sorts of classified documents about individuals trying to cross borders that are kept for international security reasons in ways that they will never even know they exist, that automatically bar their cases, with no right to know, no right to redress, no right to annotate those documents. So documentation is absolutely integral to these crises. And I would just say one more thing here too, is that this is not just documentation used to verify identity and to verify also that you are not in some way a deceitful person who's trying to do something that they're not supposed to do, or in a way they're not supposed to do it. But this documentation is also what ensures your survival and your well-being into the future, and that of your children and of your grandchildren. You have to be able to show, for example, evidence of familial relationships, of claims to citizenship, that you might need to be able to go back 2 generations. If you went from Bosnia to Austria in the past, you might be able to claim Austrian citizenship if you could just get access to your grandparents' or great-grandparents' documents. It's the right to benefits, it's the right to education, it's the right to healthcare, it's claims to property that would help you perhaps to be able to go back and resettle where you came from, rather than remaining in a country that it wasn't your intent to go to in the first place. So these are massive questions that have very large knock-on implications as well as in immediate crises.
Excuse me. I'm going to mention one more point about the definitional question, because sometimes crises are equated with refugee flows, and they're not the same thing. There are many complex migratory flows around the world today, as in the past, that have never been defined as crisis or as refugee flows, and but I think when the aspect of threat is introduced, then a refugee flow, an ongoing migratory flow may likely be redefined as a crisis. So, for instance, in the case of the number of border crossings in the 2000s, for instance, it reached 1.5 million a year. That was not defined as a crisis. There were responses, but not a crisis. The immediacy that crisis required wasn't there. when Central Americans migrated from war-torn countries in the 80s. They were categorized in different ways as economic migrants, as undocumented immigrants in various ways, except of course as refugees. But my point here is that refugee flows and crisis are not the same thing. And then we are left with when and how and who defines an ongoing flow as a crisis. And there are a variety of actors, of course, that take place in framing a regular phenomenon into a crisis and get in that mode. We have state actors, of course, policymakers, but we also have, and we will probably talk a little bit later on about the media and the role of the media in this, and of interest groups as well. Debbie Fitzgerald and Ron just wrote a very good paper in the annual review of sociology on their call for us to integrate the study of refugee flows with the study of international migration, and they include a very thoughtful reflection on the role of NGOs, for instance, in the work of refugees. And so I think we have to think broadly about who and when are regular migratory flows when they are redefined and reframed as crisis. In terms of the media, we will probably, yes, we will talk about the media later. In repeating what policymakers and government officials, elected officials, public officials say, what they plan to do, what they do, their decisions, the media play a central role in shaping what we know, how we learn public's responses, attitudes, and so I think we cannot leave out the role of the media in sustaining framings of migratory flows as crisis, and in keeping the public primed for understanding and for receiving that information and accepting these new constructions or these framings as of regular migratory flows as crisis. So I think that's just wanted to mention the level of the media that sifts the information that we receive.
Yeah. And I'll say, so one of the major challenges that we face as migration scholars is naming the moment both in the particular and in the universal kind of global context of how refugee crises are constructed alongside this tension of a human rights moment. So I'll speak to that a little bit from the perspective of the universal, of the refugee crisis in a global context. And I think, one area that I'm thinking a lot about is, decoding the algorithm to how these crises are both co-constitutive of one another across cases, and how states and actors learn from one another in terms of developing and fortifying these technologies to police refugees that are defined as a problem, a crisis. So just a couple of my thoughts about when I think about how do I name this moment in a global context. We are definitely in a moment of global neoliberalism that expresses itself in very particular ways in not only within nation states but within regions, right? So it's very difficult to put one's finger on how that neoliberalism is expressing itself, but we can kind of understand the contours of it by this indirect governance of populations, biopolitics, right, where the state is not necessarily having its hands on the population, but necessarily influencing it nonetheless. It's also articulated by extreme hyper-surveillance. And we're seeing this not only through technologies of surveillance of the looking at, but as Anne shared with us and scared us a bit about the level of surveillance technologies through documentation and records, right, and the creation of records. And then also carcerality in extreme form. So those are some ways to think about and contextualize this neoliberal moment as it relates to mass migration flows in this moment of the rise of the global right, right? However, within a context of human rights, there's a tension there, right? And the way that I see that playing out is human rights is also neoliberalized in that human rights become an individual right with individual responsibilities for migrant groups to for their outcomes or failures, right? And that then primes those frames for why some groups are faring well and others aren't, right? It's this individual individual kind of responsibility. So I want to draw an example of what from some armchair sociology. So if you all will allow me, I recently came back from doing a month of field work in Australia. It was my first time to the country, and I went to kick off my research on education, right? But I couldn't help but notice the intense immigration situation there. And it's something that I'm not going to turn a blind eye to. I'm going to look into this in a more serious way. So what Australia lent to me as a case was, again, this inverse case where I think I'm familiar just as a U.S. citizen of thinking about migrant and refugee crises being constructed around physical border, and that articulation and framing is then framed as invasion, right? And it is ratcheted up through a hyper-seeing of the other. Look at these refugees that are coming to invade. So there is a hyper-visualization, there's an aesthetic to the construction of that refugee crisis. However, being in a case where when the borders are aquatic, it requires a different algorithm and a different technology to construct that crisis. And what is that? It is this hyper-unseeing. If we keep the other invisible, the problem is not ours, it's something that's over there, and it doesn't, as long as it doesn't hit the border, it's not our problem. So in Australia, how is refugee constructed? Immigrants come by plane. Refugees are boat people, and that's literally a category that they use, that's used in public discourse to describe people. But who are these boat people? They're amorphous and elusive, and when you ask, everyday Australians, they really don't know. There's no way to kind of point their finger at what that actually looks like, because the government, the state, does a great job of keeping refugees out of the media. They focus on what to do with the immigrant problem, the folks who do get to come and touch land. So this unseeing, I would offer as another technology of hyper documentation in the inverse of just erasure, and we know that archives can do that as well. So Australia has. I would dare say that they are the most advanced nation state in terms of contracting island territories out for the sole purpose of creating refugee and asylum-seeking processing centers, which really are prisons, right? But they are out of sight, out of mind, so far from country that the general public does not have to engage and or think about or lend any empathy to these distant refugees. Australia has contracted Manus, Nauru, and Christmas Island. Those are the main territories that they've not occupied them. These are contractual relationships that the state has developed with these Micronesian islands, island territories, and how refugees are, they're termed as refugee processing centers, but really that is where refugee populations are held in perpetuity to either go insane. The suicide rate is ridiculously high, so they either through death by suicide, or they just rot on those islands, or they're inflicted by not only intense rampant disease, but communicable disease as well. So it's a slow death on these islands, but one that's not seen. So when we think about human rights, it's the most kind of vicious and inhuman technology that I think that, the mechanism that allows for it to perpetuate itself is this hyperunseeing. So I'll make one last comment. So what becomes dangerous about this is not idiosyncratic. So while in Australia, I became, again, just really concerned, alarmed, and obsessed with what I was witnessing, and also alarmed that I didn't have interlocutors that also saw it as a big problem, right? And I'm talking about just in public space, not with other academics. But these technologies and the way in which refugee populations resist is through these smartphones. So we have the example of, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Belrus Buras. He's do you know how to pronounce his name?
No, this is mine because I struggle also.
Yes. Yes, so someone who is detained on Manus Island and has been for the past 6 years. He is a Syrian refugee, and he texted a book. He texted just with a journalist what he was going through, what he was witnessing from this island, all of the atrocities, human rights atrocities that he was witnessing, and this journalist translated the book into English and published it, right? So there are these ways in which the technology is then turned against the state to open up a space for new public discourse. But at the same time, while I was out there right before I left Australia, unfortunately, I opened the newspaper. Denmark announced that they too have they're experimenting with contracting an island. And what did the Prime Minister say? We're borrowing this. We like what Australia's doing, and we're trying to see if that mode of managing the refugee crisis will work for us here. So I think. Thinking through the algorithms of the aquatic versus the land borders and how the crises are managed and framed also will help us name and keep our finger on the algorithm. And we've got to see the matrix for what it is in a global context.
And a little bit out of order here, but I just wanted to mention something that I meant to remind you earlier, that state responses that like those we see in the United States today, and the carceral turn and the punitive turn, that result in detention that looks like prison-like conditions, and the expansion of surveillance techniques through ankle bracelets and all sorts of surveillance techniques that Anna has mentioned are absolutely not just what happens in the United States. We have the cases of Australia and Western Europe, and the engagement of what are called transfer countries or migration corridors, Mexico, North Africa, Eastern Europe, in the control and surveillance and the response of the state to migrations when they are classified as crises.
Yeah, so my question is related to the datification of identity as well as the role of the media in shaping how we talk about the current refugee crisis. Increasingly, particularly after 9/11, we see that legal status and identity are being codified using biometric technology and surveillance technology. In an earlier session, we talked about how discretion is replicated through algorithms. So the first question is, what role does the media play in framing how we think about refugees? So two examples I think about is how the media has played an important role in Mexico and how we think about Central American refugees, with this one clip of a woman from Honduras that she rejected a plate of food. And that automatically increased anti-immigrant sentiment in Mexico. At the same time, there have been some journalists that have used sort of what we use as participatory action research. So Adolfo Flores from BuzzFeed gave cameras to refugees so that they could document their journey throughout Mexico. Then the second part of these questions are more related to datification of identity. What role do you envision that artificial intelligence will shape how we think about accountability at the border? For example, who's responsible for discrimination? Is it the coder? Is it the machine? Is it the government? And the externalization of border enforcement, particularly as countries collaborate more often to share data on migrants and perceived national security threats. For example, we have seen how activists and even lawyers are being deported from Mexico or arbitrarily sent to secondary inspection when they cross into the US because their documents are flagged by unknown government or intelligence agencies. So what are the implications of turning technology as an instrument to turn immigrant rights advocates as involuntary informants for the state? So we can start maybe with you.
You want to start with me?
Yes. Okay.
Well, maybe I'm going to try to invert those questions a little bit because I can probably say more about the second one than the first one. But just to pick up also on what Karida said, these are global crises. They're global phenomena, and they're caused by practices that affect people outside of our own region. So our own behaviors affect other people. But it often suits governments to make it seem a national problem. And I think that media have been very good at drawing attention and humanizing the local situations, and governments are clamping down on them too. And in the countries I work in, it's become illegal in some of those countries for people to help migrants, to help refugees, to report on them, and illegal where you'll be put in prison as well. So there's a clamping down on that. But I want to give you two examples of new surveillance systems that are coming up in Europe, which I think immediately say, they give the lie to the notion that these are national problems. It's perfectly obvious that governments with different politics, or increasingly the same kinds of politics, recognize the international dimensions of these problems, but they don't own them. They're just looking to try to clamp down on them. So there's a system now in Europe called Eurodac, which is a system for taking fingerprints. They take fingerprints from asylum applicants. They had been taking fingerprints from applicants from the age of 14 upwards. This is a biometric technology. They're going to reduce that to applicants from the age of 6 upwards, even though we know that fingerprints are not reliable for people who are that young. That system is sent, all of those fingerprints are sent to the European Commission. There's a big centralized database from all over Europe. They are shared with Switzerland, they're shared with Norway, they're shared with Iceland, and they're shared with the United States. The United States then shares it with all of their Five Eyes intelligence partners, who are Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Well, United Kingdom still at the moment being inside the European Union is like doubly in the middle of all of this. A second system that is being brought up is called I-Border Control, which stands for Intelligible Portable Border Control System. This is designed to control third-party nationals crossing borders of European Union states. This is a system that uses 4 different technologies, and this is where artificial intelligence really comes into play. One of those is biometric authentication. So that could be fingerprints, it could be iris readings, it could be various other things. It uses document authentication, and this is, the chip in your password, in your passport, or whatever other form of verification you can produce for your document. It also uses something that is called automatic deception detection. This is a camera that will look in your face at the border and decide whether you're lying or not. It's an automated lie detector. It is, and the fourth part is what they call, and this is the artificial intelligence, a risk assessment. So every other amount of data they have on you, how often you've crossed that border, who you're communicating with, what they know, from other forms of data about you, who you're related to, anything else that they have, all goes into a big reasoning system. And based on that, they make a decision about whether you can cross that border. You don't know this is happening. Nothing tells you that this is going on, this is what's happening. What they say is that this is to reduce subjective control and workload of human agents and to increase objective control. So we think about these as examples, and what are some of the implications of these? First of all, biometric data itself leads to conditions of hyper-surveillance. Biometric data is definitely not infallible. There are that your fingerprints, as I said, when you're younger, are not set. Iris scanning doesn't work if your eyes are damaged. It may not work if you've got very dark eyes as well. That's racially skewed. Images that are not well taken may not be read well. DNA also plays into this. So at refugee camps now, DNA is being collected from people who want to enter refugee camps. UNHCR has put this in place as a way to create a base identity record for people who cannot produce one when they arrive. There is a real human need to have a base identity record in order to be able to build the rest of your life. That's why they're doing it. But on the other hand, it is being used in all sorts of other ways. So there is a consenting process that happens, but is it full, free, informed consent when you arrive with your family or who you're traveling with at the entrance to a refugee camp? And that's the way in. You give the DNA of your children, you give your own DNA. This is, and the UN then, the UNHCR shares this with Interpol. So this data is out the door. It's gone. And this is true for most of the biometric data that's being collected as well. So you don't know, there is no process for knowing who owns your identity, with whom it is shared, where it is located, and to what extent it is secure. And I guarantee that the agencies that have this data, and there are many agencies that have this data, have no idea about what they will do with it in the long term, or how its integrity will be protected, and how, even with the best of intentions, they will protect it against hacking, against corruption, whether the allies they've shared the data with now remain their allies in the future. Your DNA, your family member's DNA, can be used to identify people by criminal justice systems. They can be used over generations. They can be used to reunite families, and they can be used to separate out family units that are non-traditional family units that are traveling together, that are not biologically related. My colleagues in the UK at the Data Justice Lab refer this as a shift from identification to what they call biomarkers of deceit. The assumption of these systems is that you are trying to deceive somebody else. You're not arriving in any kind of innocent state. So that is the a priori assumption. A few other things I just wanted to say about these systems. One is there's very little accountability built into any of this. And also, this is a very fast moving, just like with the legal and regulatory environment, it's moving really, really fast. And there hasn't been enough time to think through all of the accountability issues. There's a huge predication on the myth of infallibility of bio data, but infallibility of machines to figure things out. What if the machine gets it wrong? Is there any system that says when you turn down an asylum request based on the judgment, the artificial intelligence-based judgment of this system, that there's a human that then reviews the case and looks to see whether the judgment is really okay? There is, of course, the normal, what we would normally see in the field, the rhetoric of efficiency and effectiveness of doing this work. Another thing that we have to think about is the rate of corporate investment that is going on in these systems. These are being developed out of the corporate sector. There's a tremendous amount of concern that the most vulnerable people on this planet they're basically lab rats. They're being, first of all, their privacy and their security is being compromised by these systems at a rate that far exceeds people who fall outside these systems. But this technology that's being developed will be implemented on everybody, and very, very soon, very, very soon. So that the corporate sector isn't there out of the goodness of its heart, even on the side of the aid agencies. That Microsoft and various other large corporate entities are working closely with international aid organizations. But that technology is coming, that's being repurposed in other ways for wider uses as well. There is an issue about removing the discretion of the bureaucrat or the border agent or the judge in the middle of all of this. For as much as we may say that we have real problems with those individuals in all sorts of situations, the room for discretion of somebody is disappearing really, really fast. And I think the other danger we have to look out for, archives always have empty spaces in them. They have narratives they don't tell. But the proliferation or the multiplicity of archives is how later we are able to excavate a more complicated narrative. There's a real danger with these technologies that they not only trump other kinds of archives, whether they be ones developed through social media or ones developed, through official record keeping, but they actually put them out of business altogether, and particularly other forms of official record keeping.
Can I piggyback off
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, now that we're not going to sleep again. Yes.
I feel like the name of this panel should be the Terror Squad. So,
1984.
my remarks are really brief, but I wanted to just piggyback off of something that you raised, Anne, and that's the commercialization of these biometric markers, and how we, and when I say we, I mean as a pseudo-middle bourgeoisie class, are then implicated in the diffusion of these technologies and how it's coming for all of us. So I think about my own case with signing up for Clear. I travel a lot. The last thing I want to do is wait on long lines at the airport.
Gave it away.
So I gave my biometric data, fingerprints, iris, facial recognition. So anyone who has Clear, by show of hands, how many of us have Clear? Okay, so we're the only ones who fell for it.
I reckon the immigration service already had it all. So
Yeah, that's right.
So for a small entry fee, right, you gift your biometric data to TSA, but who knows who else? Like really,
that was the incentive.
That's the incentive. But the enrollment of the public through commercial kind of incentivized programs accelerates this. And I'll say between Clear and Global Entry, which I also have, Global Global Entry not only it creates a DNA code on your passport, on the physical document, right? So there's a way in which when you travel through any international airport, your passport, whatever the coding underneath it has that global entry data embedded in it. So these technologies of surveillance are also counterbalanced to other publics to then create this panopticon, right? That works off of each other. So it's just something to keep your eye on. I'll also note, I guess, so I can't go anywhere without everybody knowing exactly where I am, because, so also with entering Australia, I'm very familiar with different visa processes. Never have I had to, before entering country, you have to pay a small, like $15 fee for what's not a visa. It's like a, hey, I'm coming to Australia type. I think it's called an ETA. You can pay the $15, you get it immediately. It's really not a clearance. What it is it puts one of those markers on your passport. So any time that you're entering the country of Australia, it shares it with its allies. So again, there's a mirror kind of relationship going on here with the humanitarian biometric market as well.
Just to add a different, to complement what's been said in terms of the media aspect, and to touch bases on what was just talked about. So the media is out there to make money. So and hence the connection with corporations, right? So they're owned. It becomes a challenge when many of the media outlets are owned by the same corporation that may have particular sort of biases, particular interests, as is what happens here in the U.S. And while those are posed challenges because they can influence the markets and the actual radio stations or broadcasters to try to cover certain information, you can also have the power of the people to change that. And I'll give an example. And I'll just say, one example of what's happening with immigrants is the phrase illegal. Okay, so the way that the word illegal continues to be used over and over again provides this bias, almost this imperceived bias that we have, or that we could easily have without even thinking about it, towards certain people. Again, the dehumanization, making it okay, etc., thinking that there's only one way of addressing the problem, how it may be defined. A few years ago, I was working on something similar in the area of violence. And when I looked at violence, found that when people thought about violence, again, the mind went to criminal justice, police. That was the answer. And partly because that was the sole construct for violence. It wasn't connected to health. And so with violence, there's only one response. It was a response of, well, just lock them up. Stronger sort of punishment. If you think about health, you can think about prevention. You think about a different paradigm. And you can also reframe how you talk about the message. So here in California, I was part of a movement. The movement included the communities involved, particularly involved with violence. And we were able to move and help to refocus the media from focusing primarily on young males of color running on covers of Time and other magazines as if they were akin to some kind of animals in the jungle, to focusing on that instrument that increases the severity of what happens when you have violence, that being the gun. And identifying that down here in Southern California was the major manufacturer of what was called back then Saturday night specials. And long story short, as part of a movement, the media started covering stories about guns, particularly about that entry gun. There was a policy identified about banning them in communities. There was enough communities where Saturday night specials were banned, and ultimately we banned Saturday night specials in the state of California. Now I'm summarizing 10 years of work in 2 minutes, but all to say that the issue of the media and how it portrays things has a powerful impact on how we interpret it, and the tools that we use, the responses that we make, the things that policymakers are willing to consider, and that we have ways that have been used on previous issues of changing the frame. And I have hope. Think about Margie saying, keep hope alive. And because a few weeks ago I went to go see, and I forget the name of the director, the movie about Central America. She's a student director here. What's that? Jennifer Carcamo. Okay. A fabulous movie that connects history. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about the fact that I came in and I saw this auditorium full of students. That gave me hope. But what I thought was great about it is that they were there to see a movie about history. Because we're so often focused on the today, the now. And we separate what's happening now and the connection between now and what happened a few decades ago. And the connection related to violence and the gangs and the deportation practices, as well as the drugs, are very clear if you pay attention to history. And the role, to echo Anne, of the corporations going in, the United Fruit Company in Central America. So I think for me, not only does the violence example give me hope and awareness that these reframing can happen and a movement can change things, but also going to that movie, seeing the interest in history and connecting history with today, and seeing the number of people who were there, gives me hope that we have that movement, and we can be part of that movement.
The title is Eternos Indocumentados, Central Americans, Central American Refugees in the United States. Great film.
Thanks.
And I think I'll just say the last, because we want to give some time to questions, right? Just one quick last point about the media. Two very quick references, people who have been looking at this systematically. Julie Stewart did a very interesting analysis of the legislature proceedings and media framings in Utah around ID laws. And she found that no matter how much you try to use data, evidence-based research to counteract stereotypes, it's the one case that is used over and over and over again that is most effective, most productive in changing people's attitudes. So, so that's kind of sobering for us who do this work. But also, the political scientist Brendan Nyhan has been also looking at media cues and how we understand and how we are affected by media. And he finds something very interesting. We tend to think of fake news, of something out there, and it is. His research shows that under 15% of the population actually get their news from these extreme right websites. But the problem is with the legitimate sources of media, because it's not that it's a problem, but it's in the way the media, the legitimate credulous media presents news. Because in presenting news in headlines, bylines, the legitimate news repeat often what politicians say, and in doing so, we get those messages, those pieces of news as evidence sometimes. So, for instance, in his research, he's calculated that the current president has said over 8,000 times he has said things that are wrong or misinformed.
Only?
In just 2 years. In just 2 years. So they have actually counted, and so over 8,000 times. But then the regular media, not the extreme fake news, the regular media in transmitting news, they share that with us. And so we have to remain very careful about how we read things, because we can be reading the New York Times or the LA Times or whatever. But it's not, even if the media are critical, by just transmitting the misinformation, we're living in 1984, I guess. I don't know how to say this, but yes, so that's the last point I wanted to make, so that we can. Do you have any more questions?
Maybe
The
we'll
moderators?
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your insightful comments. I learned a lot even about technology. Maybe we'll take 3 questions and then get your responses. So, Maggie?
So one thing about your discussion that I was thinking about, migrant crisis, and I always tell this to my undergrads. They're like, oh, the European migrant crisis. I was like, why was that a crisis? And the 3.5 million Syrians in Turkey are not, or the fact that Lebanon, like a fifth of their population is now Syrians. So this sort of brings up the question of, are migrant crises a luxury of wealthy nations? Are we, and this is something maybe, Rolanda, if you want to answer, you guys from your work in Jordan, but like, how do and I just don't know well enough, and I think that we could all probably maybe do more research in the developing world on migration, because so much of it is done in the developed world. And I'm thinking about how much of these sort of language of crises is reproduced. And in some cases, like, it really kind of, like, if your country population increases by a fifth, like, maybe that really is kind of like a crisis, but how does that get reproduced in these areas? Or is this just another language that, you know, wealthy nations are using to, you know, legitimize their own original borders?
Thank you.
So this builds a little bit on what Maggie's saying and goes back to the questions. This is more of a thought experiment than a question, but if anyone wants to respond to it, that's great. Otherwise, it'll be a rhetorical question. But, imagine that we weren't at a conference on migration studies, but we're at a conference. But imagine we were instead in the conference on speech writing. And reframe the question as not, is this a crisis, but rather, when are we going to call this a crisis? And I'm just I've been thinking. I'm not sure I have the answers to this, but I want to know why that works. This is the flip side of many things that you said, but it's a different way to reorganize what you said into a different type of coherence.
Right.
Why does it work? How does it work? You know, I mean, some tentative answers, maybe it does localize the problem. Maybe it does mobilize the media in a certain way. Maybe it enhances selectivity. Maybe it creates comfort and order in response to chaos. But I think it's worth thinking about because that's a different way to pose and answer the question, and I think it does so in a way that might dig a little deeper into what's going on, and it may respond to Maggie's question actually, because it says, well, we have these conditions that allow us to use the crisis label, and those conditions may include what you said. I think it's worth thinking about because it's a different way to think about the moment. It also it comes up to the precise question, which was raised in my mind by what something Karida said. I'm curious about the relationship between making sure that a crisis is unseen and making it a crisis. I mean, intuitively, they seem really the opposite. To make it invisible, but then to make it really. But I feel like both are going on, and that's I'm trying to get my brain around that too.
And then behind you, somebody else had the question.
Somebody else has that.
Oh, okay.
Well, I had two questions. One of them is about the role of the media in the creation of. Well, in the way we perceive what happens around us, I think it's taken for granted that the media should cover not only the actions but also the words of politicians. And I was thinking, if doesn't that perpetuate the power of politicians by making them the center of everyday conversation. And what if, for example, we had a more participatory media, more oriented towards communities, towards everyday people, if that could change the balance of power outside from corporations or large politicians. And my second question was, it struck me during this particular conference that the work crisis could mean very different things. For example, when we think about refugee crisis or migratory crisis, it struck me like we think a lot about how it affects a crisis for the receiving country, but not a crisis for the country that sends people away. So can we change the way we use the word, or could it matter?
So I'll say a few things, and then other people can add. But so good points, and I think they're all interrelated. These questions. I almost seemed like you were planted to all three of you. You're right to sort of talk about these different viewpoints, but there are different factors, right? So we can break it up. We can look at the host country, right? The country that sort of the person left, right? And or more closely, the community, right? And then, of course, the people, right, who are leaving. But then also the places that they go across, right? So it could be the same country, or it could be a number of different countries, right? So all of those are different parts that I think could potentially contribute to sort of at what point you call it a crisis, and then the conditions in those places, right? And the condition of those folks. So all this to say that it is much more complex. There are various different factors, and I think there are issues of who's doing the defining. In most cases, it's the media, it's corporations, it's politicians. I don't think it's people, the communities. At least it doesn't get globalized. But those are anyway. That's just a initial ball to throw it to my colleagues here.
I would say the thing that always strikes me is how little we hear about Yemen. That is just the most horrendous things happening in Yemen. Why are we not hearing about Yemen? We're not hearing about Yemen because America has a relationship with Saudi Arabia, and so I think we have to think about what the politics are between the different states. We don't hear as much about Turkey as we might hear about, in part because of politics that relate politics inside Turkey and politics with Turkey, but language is also another issue. The project that I run, we've been working through the Arabic media as well as through the English language media, and we've been trying to see what's showing up in each media. There's very little that is sort of nitty-gritty in the Arabic media. Why is this? What's going on there? I think we can't ignore the fact that media are controlled in many countries, and even in other countries where we like to think our media are freer, they're owned by a lot of the corporate and political interests and in very large conglomerates. I see still a lot of hope for the independent, individual, participatory individual to be able to use, these kinds of devices to get things out, because it's very difficult to get around all of these other systems that are at work. But I think also to think about Hiroshi's question, when are we going to call this a crisis? I think it's a huge question about who the we is that's calling it a crisis. We have villagers and farmers calling a crisis on when there are streams of individuals moving through where they live, positively and negatively in both respects. Do they get to call it a crisis? Does anybody pay attention? Probably not until their politics align with the politics of their own government. But otherwise, it probably goes unnoticed. So I think asking the question that way around, you've also got to say, who's the we who's calling a crisis? Because do the migrants themselves get to call a crisis? I think these are really, where's the power? Where's the power behind that question?
Yeah, Maggie and Hiroshi, I think yes, your questions are very, very similar. And who gets to call it a crisis? Is it wealthy countries that have the power to do that, and why? And is this related to maintaining borders? And I think I agree with you in that. And it's part of a bigger question too, because once we think of a population as problematic, as generating concern, or crises are never nice, they never have a positive connotation. So once you do that, you then not only focus immediate attention on this population, but also forget and disregard the other domestic groups, other populations, and focus on the bordering of the nation. And of course, who gets to do this? It's the certain receiving countries. And we just had a very interesting discussion in my immigration seminar. So this comes from the students, not from me. They came to this reflection that a lot of what we see today in terms of framing certain groups as crisis and others as not, others are not, that some of the groups that are classified as such are groups that come from countries that were either a former colony or were linked in one way or another historically, militarily to the receiving country, and then in reclassifying them in this way, continue to separate them and keep them out of the borders, whether internal or external borders. So I think it is part of that bigger question of defining the nation and who belongs and who doesn't. So yes.
I think a related question is, who gets to say a crisis is over? And something else we're hearing in the media too, because it's the other side of this, I think.
Yeah. My response really draws on is an elaboration of yours, Cecilia. So just to give an amalgamated response, the speech, I like that exercise. Who gets to have a crisis, and what about the relational kind of framing between sending and receiving countries? And I think to the 1970s Black British rallying cry, we are here because you were there. And this, if it were my speech, this is not a global refugee crisis. It is the long reckoning with colonialism, particularly European expansion, but not primarily, but not exclusively. But we're talking about these modern forms of colonialism from 1492 on, right? So, and not just a traditional colonial relationships between metropole and colony, but also military occupations that are still going on, protectorate relationships, right? So there, we know as migrant scholars that it's no surprise who becomes the receiving populations, but in the refugee framework, it seems more elusive when it's put when it's framed as a crisis, right? And I just want to share a quote that I'll probably blur a bit from the public intellectual and cultural critic Stuart Hall. He was a Black British scholar, but he was born in Jamaica, but moved to Britain right after college as a young man. And he was doing a BBC interview in the 80s, and he made this comment that not a tea leaf grows in the UK. However, you can't think of an Englishman without thinking of tea, right? And he said, invoking his own Jamaican heritage, "We are the ones who rot your children's teeth at night. I am the sugar at the bottom of your tea." That's the speech.